Hello, I'm Dr. Thomas Gidney of the University of Geneva, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and I currently look at the history of international organizations, as well as how colonial history interacts with these organizations.
Genève Monde, at the crossroads of history.
Hello, Thomas Gidney. Nice to see you again. Today we're going to talk about the UN. It's the 80th anniversary of the organization. The United Nations were founded in 1945 in San Francisco. Can you tell us exactly the context of that creation?
The United Nations was created at the end of the Second World War at San Francisco. And in many ways, it had many similarities to its predecessor organization, that being the League of Nations, which was based in Geneva. But it also had its differences in the sense that the United Nations was formed during the Second World War as a sort of limited group of allied states. Now, at this point, it wasn't the international organization we know today, but many of the allied states referred to each other as the United Nations. If we look at communications between Churchill, Roosevelt, even Chiang Kai-shek in China, they would often refer to each other from 1941, when the United States entered the war, as the United Nations. So it was another term for the allies, in a sense. But by 1945, it had become the veritable international organization that we know it today from the San Francisco Conference. And one of the key factors back then, and one in which we might have to evaluate the UN's work today, is collective security, coming hot off the heels of the Second World War.
Let's start with collective security. We know that that's still an issue today. Is the UN an organization that succeeds in maintaining a collective security?
The United States created the UN with a hope that it would be a more decisive organization than the League of Nations, which today many people see as the ultimate example of a failed organization due to its inability to enforce collective security and deal with many of the conflicts that broke out in the 1930s. Now, there wasn't an immediate sort of Cold War that arose directly in 1945, but we can see many of the seeds of the Cold War early on in the history of the United Nations. For example, there was a lot of disagreement about the role of the Security Council. Now, the Security Council carried on from the Council of the League of Nations, in that permanent members, which were essentially the great powers of the Second World War, would have a veto on the Security Council's role in military intervention, but also actions in enforcing collective security. That the United States and Britain, to perhaps a lesser extent, wanted a Security Council that would not face the sort of deadlock that we often see today, whilst the Russians under Stalin demanded that there be a veto. And this essentially, this veto is essentially what defines much of the inactivity that we see in the UN's role pretty much from the outset. But I think that as we go along, we can see a mix of successes, especially in the early days of the UN when it comes to collective security, and perhaps more recently quite a few litanies of failure of collective security as well.
Let's take some examples. 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. What's the context and what is the role of the UN?
So during the Second World War, the Koreas were essentially divided between the northern part, which was dominated by the Russians, and then the communists under Kim Il-sung, and the south, which I can't say was a democracy. It was also an authoritarian state, but one under the patronage of the United States. And in 1950, with the blessing of Stalin, Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea. Now, Korea is a very interesting example of what many consider a success of the United Nations, even though one can debate whether the Korean War was ultimately a success from the American perspective. And one of the reasons why is that the Security Council did not necessarily function in the way that we would expect it to. So after the invasion, the Security Council launched Resolution 84, which allowed the United States to lead an intervention in Korea to restore peace. The reason why this passed, and why we rarely see examples now, was because the Soviet Union, which ordinarily would have vetoed the decision to allow the United States to lead an intervention, was boycotting the United Nations. And why was it boycotting the United Nations? Because the permanent seat on the Security Council that had been kept for China, because the China that joined the United Nations after the Second World War was the Republic of China under the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, was being now held in 1950 by Taiwan. They had been driven off the mainland, and now the People's Republic of China had been established. And there was a lot of resistance from the United States and Britain and other Western states to allow the People's Republic of China to be the official representative at the United Nations and the Security Council. The United States was able to very successfully put together a coalition because of the fact that the Russians were not able to block it as they were boycotting the UN. Mm-hmm. This led to the intervention led by the United States, which very quickly kicked out the North Koreans from South Korea. However, as we can often see in the few cases where a UN mandate could be brought in, the United States then decided to go well beyond the mandate given to it. And this is why Korea is perhaps slightly more ambiguous. So the resolution that the United Nations had given the United States was essentially to liberate South Korea from North Korea. But the Americans decided to press beyond the borders, invade North Korea, all the way up to the Yalu River, which separates North Korea from China. Now, in this case, this provoked a very severe Chinese backlash, and the Chinese intervened. And essentially pushed the United Nations forces back to the 38th parallel, and then later to what would later be called the demilitarized line once a ceasefire was established. And this is the same line which separates the Koreas today. So on the one hand, we see the ability when some Security Council states do not participate for the UN to intervene quite effectively. On the other hand, in this case, the United States definitely exceeded the mandate that had been given to it and provoked a backlash from the Chinese. So there is that nuance about Korea.
Genève Monde, the shared history of international Geneva.